When Walt Disney founded his company, he had no money, no camera, and no artists to help him animate his ideas. In fact, Disney Studios began in a tiny backyard shed because Walt and his brother couldn't afford to rent a proper space. That humble shed would eventually grow into a global entertainment empire, earning nearly $100 billion a year and housing some of the biggest creative studios on Earth. This is the story of how a high school dropout, once homeless and twice bankrupt, built a multi-billion-dollar empire, starting with nothing but a pencil and a dream. In 1901, Walt Disney was born in Chicago, Illinois, the fourth son in a struggling working-class family. His father, Elias, was a hard worker who bounced between odd jobs and failed ventures. With every disappointment, the burden fell on Walt and his brothers to help support the household from a young age. But with each new setback, Elias changed. He became cold, and oftentimes even violent, beating Walt and his brothers with whatever he could find. In an attempt to start fresh, the family moved frequently, beginning with a farm in Marceline, Missouri. But the new setting didn't change Elias. His violent outbursts continued, and eventually, the two oldest boys ran away from home, leaving Walt and the younger siblings to carry the load. It was around this time that Walt turned to drawing, not just as a hobby, but as an escape. Whenever he had a spare moment, he'd sketch animals from around the farm. His father did not share the excitement. Elias ridiculed Walt's drawing and punished him if it ever got in the way of chores. But even with the entire family working on the farm, they still couldn't make ends meet. Eventually, they moved again, this time to Kansas City, Missouri, hoping for better opportunities. There, Elias bought a newspaper route and put 9-year-old Walt and his brother Roy to work delivering papers before sunrise. Since their father refused to pay them, Walt took on more work to make his own money, selling papers after school, delivering medicine, and sweeping floors. One freezing winter morning, while delivering papers at age 14, Walt stepped on a hidden nail buried in the snow. It pierced through his boot and impaled his toe, sending him to the hospital for 2 weeks. Stuck in bed, with his father's voice ringing in his head, telling him he'd never amount to anything, Walt had time to think, and during those last few days of recovery, Walt came to a decision. Maybe he'd never make a fortune, but he would at least do something that he loved, and that was drawing cartoons. And so, when the family moved again, this time back to Chicago so Elias could start a new venture, Walt enrolled in art classes, on the condition that they wouldn't interfere with his work. But then, in 1917, the United States entered World War I, and Walt saw an opportunity to escape. He faked his age and signed up to serve as a Red Cross ambulance driver, shipping off to France at just 16 years old. By the time he returned home, 17-year-old Walt was no longer a boy, but a determined man. He refused to finish high school or work with his father. Instead, he wanted to venture out on his own as an artist. Elias scoffed. How do you expect to make a living drawing pictures? Walt didn't know either, but one thing was clear. He had to try. Against his father's wishes, Walt packed his belongings and bought a train ticket to Kansas City in 1919. After settling in, he applied for cartooning jobs at city newspapers, but was rejected from every single one. At one point, his brother Roy urged him to look for a more practical job, but Walt refused. One day, Roy was venting to his coworkers about Walt's stubbornness, and one of them suggested he apply to work as a catalog illustrator for the Pesman Rubin Art Studio. Roy told Walt immediately, and Walt rushed over and got hired on the spot. There, Walt met a young colleague named Ub Iwerks. Unlike Walt, Ub was quiet and serious, but he was also a phenomenal draftsman. Their strengths complemented each other. Walt was the visionary, Ub was the technician. They quickly became close friends. But just 6 weeks later, the Pesman Rubin studio shut down, leaving both of them unemployed. Still, Walt stayed optimistic. He believed he and Ub had the potential to do something great. And so, in 1920, Walt convinced Ub to start a company together, iWorks Disney. The plan was to create drawings for ads and signs. They had ideas, they had passion, but they were missing one crucial thing: customers. After 2 months with no prospects, iWorks Disney was shut down. But what felt like another failure turned out to be a blessing in disguise. During the same period, Walt and Ub found jobs at the Kansas City Film Ad Company, where Walt was introduced to the world of cartoon animation. At the time, animation was still in its infancy. Techniques were still being developed from scratch, often using stop-motion puppets, clay models, or cutout figures. At work, Walt experimented with cutout animations and learned how to use a camera. In doing so, he realized something important. Hand-drawn animation felt more fluid and lifelike than using paper cutouts. This hand-drawn technique required more work and was mostly used by top studios in New York, where popular cartoon series like Coco the Clown and Felix the Cat were being produced. Eager to learn, Walt headed to the library, picked up several books on hand-drawn animation, and photocopied each page to guide him as he practiced. He then set up a makeshift studio in the shed behind his house and began creating his own cartoons after work using a second-hand camera. After completing 300 feet of film, Walt showed his cartoon to the manager of the Newman Theater Company. The manager was so impressed that he agreed to purchase the film and began featuring it in his theaters. Walt's cartoon became so popular that he quit his job, and in 1922, at age 20, he formed his next company, Laugh-O-Gram Films. To differentiate themselves from other studios, Laugh-O-Gram focused on something new, a series of animated cartoons based on traditional fairy tales, but with a modern twist and humor. Walt pitched the idea to investors and raised enough money to rent office space. He signed a deal with pictorial clubs to deliver 6 fairy tale cartoons based on the Grimm brothers' stories, then quickly recruited Ub Iwerks and 5 other animators to help with production. The only problem? Walt didn't have enough money to pay his team steady salaries, so in return, he promised to share the profits from the cartoons. The truth was, Walt himself was living hand to mouth. The studio struggled to make ends meet, and he was eventually evicted from his home for failing to pay rent, forcing him to sleep on the floor of his office. He showered at the train station and ate unheated canned beans just to survive. Still, Walt and his team worked tirelessly to complete all 6 cartoons for pictorial clubs. But when they sent them in, no money came back. That's when Walt discovered the devastating truth. Pictorial clubs had gone bankrupt. Faced with mounting debt, Walt came up with a bold, risky idea to save the studio. Instead of cutting back, he decided to go all in by producing the most ambitious film he could dream of, Alice's Wonderland. The short film would feature a real girl named Alice who enters a cartoon world, an inversion of the common technique of placing animated characters into live-action settings. It was an expensive gamble, but Walt believed this reverse approach could disrupt the animation industry and save his company. As he worked on the film, he sent letters to distributors hoping to find someone to invest in the project, but the few who responded said they weren't interested. Eventually, halfway through production, Walt went completely broke. Unable to cover his workers' pay or rent on his office, he was evicted again. With no team, no money, and an unfinished film, Walt's dream of saving Laugh-O-Gram Films was over. In 1923, Laugh-O-Gram Films went out of business. Walt had no job, no money, not even a pair of shoes. His last pair was at a cobbler's, and he couldn't even afford the few cents to pick them up. By that point, Walt had given up on his dream of being a cartoonist. His new goal? To try his luck in film as a director. But he knew Kansas City wasn't the place for that. If he wanted a real shot, he had to go where movies were made. At the time, Hollywood was becoming the new headquarters of emerging studios like Universal, Paramount, Warner Brothers, and MGM, which were raking in money. So in August of 1923, Walt sold his camera, bought a train ticket to Los Angeles, and arrived with just $40 in his pocket and an unfinished reel of Alice's Wonderland. He moved in with his uncle, dressed in his best clothes, and visited every movie studio in town. But his luck didn't improve. Every studio rejected him as a director. When he begged for any job, they told him there were no openings. Walt concluded that his only way into the movie business was to make cartoons again. Luckily, there was a glimmer of hope. One of the New York distributors Walt had written to months earlier, Margaret Winkler, had seen and liked his early work on Alice's Wonderland. She reached out and offered to pay him for a full series of Alice cartoons. Walt was thrilled. There was just one catch though. He had 3 months to finish the first film. Walt had no money, no camera, no studio, and no animators, and the young actress who played Alice, Virginia Davis, was still in Kansas City. So he turned to his brother Roy for help and convinced him to start a new business, Disney Brothers Studios. Roy would handle business, Walt would handle production. With a loan from their uncles and some support from their parents, they bought a second-hand camera, set up a small shop in their uncle's garage, and persuaded the Davis family to move to Hollywood. Walt worked himself to the bone animating and directing the rest of Alice's Wonderland, and somehow finished ahead of schedule. His determination paid off. The short was a hit, and Winkler asked Walt to keep producing more episodes. Now that he had consistent work, Walt began recruiting staff and animators, including his best friend, Iwerks. Walt wanted his cartoon to be the best in the industry, and he knew his drawing skills weren't the strongest. So he let handle most of the drawing while he focused on storytelling and direction. In 1927, they created their first fully animated cartoon series for Universal Pictures, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald became an even bigger success than Alice, but Walt had a new vision for animation. He didn't want his characters to just be drawings. He wanted them to have personality. This was a radical idea at the time. Walt pushed his team to define characters through movement, gesture, and acting, not just appearance. To make his cartoons more dynamic, he borrowed techniques from live-action film, camera angles, cinematic lighting, and editing rhythms. He was building a new visual language for animation, one that would soon change the medium forever. But just as success arrived, trouble followed. While Disney was enjoying Oswald's growing popularity, their distributor, Margaret Winkler, had slowly handed over more power to her husband, Charles Mintz. Mintz was a shrewd businessman. When it came time to renew Disney's contract for Oswald, Walt traveled to New York to negotiate. Walt requested a slight pay increase given Oswald's success, but Mintz wanted to cut his pay instead, offering far less than the current rate, not even enough to cover production costs. Walt was confused. That's when Mintz revealed his plan. Over the previous months, he had secretly poached Walt's entire team, except for Iwerks, to come work with him and threatened Disney with producing the Oswald series himself if he didn't agree to his terms. To make matters worse, Walt came to realize that the rights of every character he produced belonged to the distributors, a common practice at the time, meaning Mintz could legally take Oswald and Alice away from Disney if he so desired. Walt was devastated, but he refused to cave. He turned Mintz down and vowed that from then on, he would own every character he created. With his team gone, Oswald stolen, and his company in crisis, Walt knew he had to act fast. So he started sketching a new character, one that could bring joy to thousands, a character he wished had existed when he was a lonely, hurting boy. Little did he know that this character would soon change his life and the world forever. Back at his studio, Walt wasted no time sketching animals for a new character and eventually landed on the idea of a mouse. Initially, he named the character Mortimer, but his wife Lillian hated the name, saying it sounded too depressing. She suggested something friendlier, Mickey, and with that, Mickey Mouse was born. Walt handed the design to Iwerks, who drew a caricature of a mouse rather than a realistic one. Animation required efficiency, and the fewer lines, the better. Ub's final design was a mouse with a round belly, skinny arms, and 2-button shorts, the style worn by young men at the time. Walt loved it and began producing the first Mickey Mouse cartoons using the personality animation principles he developed with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Despite Disney's earlier success, Walt struggled to find a distributor for Mickey Mouse. No theater was interested. As always, Walt refused to give up. He needed something new to make his cartoon stand out, so he decided to add sound. By then, the first film with synchronized sound, The Jazz Singer from 1927, had become a sensation. But sound cartoons were rare, and none had succeeded. Walt wanted to change that. He started working on a Mickey Mouse short that would synchronize music and sound effects perfectly, using a click track to keep musicians on beat. However, this ambition project was so expensive, Walt mortgaged his home and borrowed from banks and relatives to finance the sound system and complete the film. Several months later, Disney premiered Steamboat Willie at the Colony Theater. It was a sensation. Audiences loved it. It became the first fully synchronized sound cartoon and one of the most influential animations in history. Suddenly, Walt began receiving offers from distributors, but everyone demanded ownership of Mickey Mouse. Walt refused. He would never again let money come between him and his characters. Eventually, he struck a deal with Pat Powers, a co-founder of Universal Pictures and the owner of the sound system used for Steamboat Willie. Powers agreed to finance Walt's cartoons while letting Disney keep the rights to Mickey Mouse. With that, Walt produced more Mickey Mouse shorts with sound, each one better than the last. Before long, Mickey became a national sensation. Movie theaters across the US launched Mickey Mouse clubs on Saturday mornings, featuring hours of Mickey shorts, themed bands, and special events, all of which only boosted his popularity further. Disney Studios expanded rapidly, attracting top animators, and soon, Walt's cartoons were now internationally recognized. But as the studio grew, so did Walt's pressure and perfectionism. His demands on iWorks and other animators were relentless, and he rarely acknowledged their efforts. Everything came crashing down when Walt discovered that Pat Powers wasn't as trustworthy as he seemed. Powers Studio, Universal Pictures, was taking the vast majority of profits from Mickey Mouse without paying any royalties to Walt, owning him hundreds of thousands of dollars. Walt decided not to sue Pat because of his influence in the movie industry. Even so, Pat would make another dirty move by luring iWorks, Walt's best friend and the man pivotal for Mickey's creation, to abandon Disney and form his own studio in 1930 with the help of Powers' financial backing. Walt was devastated and deeply hurt by iWorks' decision. To make matters worse, his wife Lillian would also suffer a miscarriage only a year later. The stress and personal turmoil led Walt to a nervous breakdown.
I did. In 1931, I had a hell of a breakdown. I went all to pieces. It was just that, and I cracked up. I just got very irritable. I got to the point that I couldn't talk on the telephone. I'd begin to cry. I had to go away.
So he took a break and traveled abroad with Lillian, trying to recover. That break, however, proved restorative. Walt returned with renewed ambition, rebuilt his team, and continued innovating under Disney's new distributor, Columbia Pictures. But even under his new partnership, the studio kept sinking deeper into debt. Walt's obsession with quality made production expensive, and Columbia refused to advance more funds. Then came a lifeline. In 1932, Joseph Schenck, the president of United Artists, approached Walt and offered to become Disney's new distributor. With United Artists, Walt was finally able to take his cartoons to the next level by working with the Technicolor company to create Disney's first full-color animated short, Flowers and Trees by Silly Symphonies, resulting in Disney winning his first Oscar for Best Cartoons in 1932. But still, award-winning shorts weren't enough for Walt. As always, he wanted more, and so he began planning his biggest undertaking yet: to create their first full-length animated film. When Walt Disney announced his plan to create a feature-length animated film in sound and color, everyone, from his wife to his colleagues, thought he had lost his mind. Up until then, cartoons were only shown in theaters as a prelude before the main films, and typically lasted between 6 and 7 minutes. No one believed audiences would sit through a cartoon for a full-length adaptation. Some doubted the film was even possible to make. But Walt was used to skepticism. He believed that if his animated film could capture the emotions and realism of live-action movies, people would watch. He chose the brothers' Grimm fairy tale, Snow White, as the foundation of his experiment. And so, in 1934, production began. However, this was no small operation. Entire new departments were created to handle the level of color, realism, and emotion Walt demanded. Disney engineers even developed a revolutionary, more advanced multi-plane camera, which allowed animators to photograph up to 7 layers of artwork separately, creating parallax depth never before seen in animation. But production costs spiraled out of control. The film's initial budget of $250,000 ballooned to nearly $1.5 million. Skeptics nicknamed it Disney's Folly, convinced the project would bankrupt the company. Once again, Walt risked everything, mortgaging his home and borrowing every nickel he could find to finish the film. Finally, in December 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered. To everyone's surprise, it exceeded even the studio's wildest expectations. It was a critical and commercial triumph. The film earned Walt a special honorary Oscar and became the highest-grossing film of its time, bringing in over $8 million in its first year, equivalent to $180 million today. With the profits, Walt paid off his debts, built a larger studio in Burbank, California, and even bought his parents a beautiful home near his own. By then, Walt Disney was hailed as the most successful man in Hollywood. Within the industry, people believed his studio's future was unshakable. Riding this wave of success, Disney began developing multiple feature films simultaneously: Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi, each one representing a bold artistic leap, pushing the limits of animation further than ever before. However, no one could have guessed that just a few years later, everything Walt had built would face its greatest challenge yet. While Walt enjoyed the success of Snow White in 1938, the year also ended with one of the greatest tragedies of his life. His mother, Flora Disney, died from asphyxiation caused by a faulty furnace in the new home Walt had purchased for his parents. Walt was devastated and blamed himself for her death. Soon after, the outbreak of World War II disrupted the global economy, causing dozens of Disney's international distribution deals to collapse. Meanwhile, the studio had already accumulated millions in debt from producing its next feature films. When Pinocchio and Fantasia were finally released in 1940, both failed to turn a profit, not because they were bad, but because the European market, which counted for 40% of Disney's earnings, had suddenly vanished due to the war. With the company now heading toward bankruptcy, Walt had no choice but to scale back production and take the company public in 1940. The IPO was a success, but going public brought new pressures. To satisfy investors, Disney was forced to cut wages and working hours, reversing its reputation for having the best pay and conditions in the animation industry. The fallout led to the Disney animators' strike of 1941, which lasted 5 weeks. Picket lines formed outside the Burbank studio. Every time Walt drove to work, he was met with shouts, insults, and banging on his car, even when his daughters were with him. The strike shook Walt deeply, and the stress began to overwhelm him. Sensing his breaking point, the US government offered Walt an escape, a cultural goodwill tour of South America to strengthen relationships during the war. For Walt, it was a necessary break. By the time he returned in 1942, America had joined the war, and Disney Studios was drafted into the effort. Like many industries, Hollywood became a tool of propaganda, and Disney was at the forefront. The studio produced films promoting American patriotism and anti-Nazi messaging, all funded by the US government. Walt did not enjoy making propaganda, but it kept the company afloat during the war. When the fighting ended, Disney refocused on original content, but the post-war years were rough. A string of financial losses and lukewarm reviews made it difficult to regain momentum. Finally, in 1950, the studio staged a comeback with the release of Cinderella and its first live-action feature, Treasure Island. Both were highly profitable and restored stability to the company. From there, Disney entered what became known as the Silver Age, releasing a series of iconic films throughout the 1950s, such as Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Sleeping Beauty, and 101 Dalmatians. But by then, Walt's heart had begun to drift. He no longer poured himself into movies the way he had with his early classics. Maybe he was bored, or maybe Walt Disney was busy dreaming something even bigger. While Disney Studios had struggled financially in the late 1940s, Walt was busy imagining his next audacious dream. During several visits to LA's Griffith Park, he watched his daughters ride the carousel and noticed the same pattern every time. The parents were bored, the ride operators were unfriendly, and the grounds were dirty and littered with trash. Theme parks in post-war America were cheap, grimy, and unsafe, not the kind of place you'd want your children to wander. Walt envisioned something entirely different, a clean, cinematic place where the magic of his films could come to life. He dreamed of building a world where the entire family could have fun together. And so, over the next few years, Walt traveled across the US and Europe studying attractions for inspiration. The place that struck him most was Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, Denmark. A pristine, family-friendly park with charming rides, glowing lights, manicured gardens, and nightly fireworks. Tivoli became the blueprint for Disneyland. But when Walt pitched the idea to his company, nobody took him seriously, not even his brother Roy. The studio was still deep in debt, and a theme park seemed impossible. But Walt pushed ahead anyway. He formed a separate company called WED Enterprises and borrowed against his life insurance to hire a team of visionary artists and engineers to get his plan started. He purchased land in Anaheim, California for what would become Disneyland. But the financial challenge was enormous. After failing to secure enough funding from investors, Walt turned to a new medium, television. In the early 1950s, TV was exploding in popularity, and networks were desperate for content. After finally convincing Disney's board of directors to support his theme park concept, Walt was able to strike a deal with ABC. In exchange for financing the Disneyland's construction, Disney would produce a weekly television show featuring cartoons, live-action skits, and behind-the-scenes looks at the park's development. The show, also called Disneyland, became a huge hit, the second most watched TV program in America, and doubled as free marketing for the park. After 2 years of construction, Disneyland finally opened in July 1955. But to Walt's dismay, opening day was a disaster. The park had prepared for 11,000 visitors, but scammers sold thousands of counterfeit tickets, pushing attendance past 28,000. Food vendors ran out of supplies, the Santa Ana freeway clogged for miles, temperatures soared under the brutal summer sun. To make matters worse, a gas leak forced closures in parts of the park, and several rides broke down. The press mocked the opening as Black Sunday. But Walt didn't flinch. He immediately addressed every problem and invited the press back. Within a year, over 3 million people had visited Disneyland. It became a global phenomenon, hailed as the happiest place on Earth. By the late 1950s, Walt Disney had finally achieved financial stability after 3 decades of struggle. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy his ambition. Drawing on everything he had learned from Disneyland, Walt began imagining something even bigger, a city of the future. Not merely a theme park, but a real, living community, complete with monorails, underground roads, and neighborhoods modeled after different cultures from around the world. This project would be called Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Set in Orlando, Florida, Epcot would demonstrate how cities of the future could be built and managed better, a showcase for technology, innovation, and urban planning. But while Walt dreamed bigger than ever, his time was running out. In 1964, he was diagnosed with lung cancer after decades of heavy smoking, long before the dangers were widely understood. Even as his health declined, Walt Disney refused to slow down. From his hospital bed, he continued working on plans for Epcot, convinced he would recover and live to see his futuristic city realized. But in November 1966, Walt Disney passed away at the age of 65. Though he left detailed plans for Epcot, his original vision, a living, working community of tomorrow, was never built. Instead, in 1971, the company opened the project under a new name, Walt Disney World. It was conceived as a tribute to Walt's dream, though the final result was very different from what he had imagined. Even so, Walt Disney World became a global phenomenon, turning Orlando, Florida into one of the most visited destinations on Earth and redefining the very idea of entertainment. Today, the Walt Disney Company is a $200 billion empire, home to Marvel, Pixar, Star Wars, and much more, all built on the vision of a man who refused to give up on his dreams.